So today I'm going to do my best to describe this conversation that I had with my friend named Quintus. I was over eating dinner with him the other day, and we got into a conversation which led us down this rabbit hole, and it ended up being incredibly interesting and insightful, and it was very confusing, but I think we did take away a few conclusions. And after our conversation, I decided to write everything down. And I eventually wanted to make it into a YouTube video. So this is going to be my attempt at doing that. So I'm going to pull up my notes here. But the whole conversation really started with us talking about aliens and whether or not we think alien life exists in the universe. And it led us down this whole rabbit hole about what exactly is the universe, what is nature, how big is the universe, are there multiple universes, and we just really got into it. So, as I said, to start, we talked about aliens, and we're thinking about the probability of existence. So, I've heard many times, if the universe is infinite, then that means that there's an infinite probability. So if we assume that the universe is infinite, that means that it's so large that there's an unimaginable number of galaxies, which have an unimaginable number of stars, and even an infinite amount of possibilities. So I've heard Joe Rogan talk about this, and he literally says, if that is true, then there's someone having this exact same conversation, having these exact same thoughts in some other part of the universe somewhere, just because of the sheer size of it. Now, that is quite a crazy thought, but we weren't necessarily convinced that the universe is completely infinite. So we were questioning the size of it and thinking about the observable universe. And for all of our purposes, the observable universe is kind of what we should consider the universe. So, I don't know, it also, this whole conversation about what is the universe, it really makes you reconsider. Okay, it's just very confusing. If there is a universe and it's not infinite, then that means the universe is sitting in something else. Like, what is beyond the universe? And so that's confusing. And if there's something beyond the universe, then could that mean there's multiple universes? So as we're kind of going back and forth and discussing just the sheer confusing nature of the universe and just how little we can possibly know about it, I decided to tell Quintus about my theory about the universe. And I like to think of the universe as an organism. I think this is very hard for people to wrap their minds around because people generally think of an organism as something that's relatively small, that is kind of confined by a body. But I'm thinking of it more as like a system. And I think that the universe is a system, and I would consider nature to be kind of a concept that is just what the entire universe is. So let me explain that a little more. My definition of nature that I've kind of been adding to and shaping over time is this: complexity as a result of simple forces over time. So from my observation, the forces in the universe are very simple, and we don't know all of them necessarily, but we know of a few, at least conceptually. Like, we know what gravity is to some degree. I don't know, we'll get into this later. We don't know exactly what it is, but we have an idea of gravity, that that mass is attracted to each other and mass accelerates towards each other. And so I like to think of nature and the entire universe as complexity as a result of simple forces over time. So you could imagine that if the universe started as just a big clump of matter, of hydrogen atoms and just simple gases. Right? Hydrogen atoms are very simple. They only have one proton, I believe. They're the most basic atomic element that we have. So if it was all just that, and then say you have one simple force like gravity, but then you also have the Big Bang, then it ends up being this explosion of matter outwards. So the matter is spreading all outwards, seemingly randomly based on this explosion, but simultaneously it's also contracting on itself. So there's just these simple forces that cause this unique combination of expansion and contraction. And with this expansion and contraction, it causes more and more complexity over time. So an analogy that can be drawn to this same concept is if you watch how fungi spreads out. There's a really good example of this. The Tokyo metro system was, I think, planned by using this slime fungi and placing nutrients on all the different nodes on a city map of Tokyo. And then they put this fungus in the middle, and at first it spreads out randomly, but then as it hits the nutrients, it condenses onto those pathways, and those pathways become more and more defined. Another example that you see in nature is if there's water raining on a mountain, say, and say at first it's a pristine mountain. As the water rains down, the water at first is just going to flow everywhere off this smooth surface, but then there's going to be slowly pathways that are carved, and this will channel the water to stay in those pathways, and those pathways will get deeper and deeper. Recently, we have a larger ability to look into neuroscience with our new technology, and scientists are discovering that it works kind of the same way as water flowing down a mountain. Like there's electricity that's flowing through our brains, through our neural pathways, and the more we do certain things, the deeper those pathways get, which is why we can practice something and get better at it, but also we can practice a negative behavior and get more attached to that negative behavior. Our pathways get deeper and more defined over time. In the same way that our pathways can get deeper and more defined, and they also are getting more complex, I would argue. And if you go back to what the universe is, it's this matter expanding outwards and then contracting on itself. And if we get a little sciencey for a second, as the matter is contracting on itself, this is how we go from having hydrogen atoms to having more and more complex atoms. Like now on Earth we have gold, which has, I don't know how many protons and neutrons, but it has a lot. And so these atoms in stars, like stars are often just big balls of hydrogen, but as their gravity gets greater and greater, it's contracting on itself, and at the center of these stars, the atoms are actually fusing together and becoming more complex atoms with more pieces. And then if you just continue down this path, things just keep getting more and more complex until we have all of the molecules of life, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then you get this ball of rock that's Earth, and basically, like, you could, in my opinion, like, life on Earth is basically just atoms and elements just getting crammed together more and more until they get complex enough that they create life. Like, eventually these things are so complex that they go from being atoms to being molecules. Certain atoms start joining together into molecules, and then these molecules start chemically interacting with each other and causing more complex molecules. And then eventually these molecules become cells and are moving around searching for nutrients, and they become more and more conscious over time until we get to the state that we have right now with humans who are able to make even more complex things. So you see this kind of natural course play out in the universe, from going from something as simple as a hydrogen atom to something as complex as the cutting edge technology that we're developing today. So this kind of leads into what my theory of the universe is as an organism. So I think that the universe possibly could be a system where things get more and more complex over time, and they get infinitely complex until they are in a similar spot to where humans are today, where we're investing huge amounts of money and resources into developing our own consciousness. You look at the top scientists around the world and engineers, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to create new consciousness. They're trying to create artificial intelligence. And if we can really manufacture consciousness, if we can create a being that can experience consciousness and we can create that mechanically, then what if we put those sentient beings into a simulation? If they're sentient, it's basically like us humans being in the universe. If we create a universe and then put life into that universe, then we're basically the gods of this new universe, and we've basically created a new universe. So my theory is that the universe has a goal. Our universe has a goal of surviving long enough so that it can reproduce, just like every organism that we see on Earth. And I would assume, based on my knowledge from Earth, that this pattern follows in other parts of the universe. So it all leads back to this argument of whether or not I think there's aliens in the universe, and I would argue that there quite possibly is aliens. I mean, it's very likely that they're aliens. I think the Earth and humans, we are one flower of the so-called plant of the universe, and we have a potential for reproducing into a new plant. If we are successful at creating new consciousness, then I would argue that we are at the end of the cycle and about to start a new cycle. It's a kind of a crazy theory, and this kind of sparked our conversation to continue because we really don't know what is at the start of the universe. We don't know much about the Big Bang. We don't know what exactly was the Big Bang. We just know that there wasn't really anything that we can observe before that, and we know that everything is expanding. Super interesting. So I'm not sure if the universe reproduces or not, but that was my theory that I introduced to him. So this led us down another rabbit hole of talking about the simulation theory, because in following this logic, if we can create a simulation and that would be the universe's way of reproducing, then that would mean that some other alien society created our universe, and we are technically sentient beings that is in this simulation. So yeah, it's very complex. And I think one thing to add is that if we do ever succeed in creating consciousness, the way that we probably will have done that is by acting the same way that the universe already acts. So to clarify that, like I said earlier, the universe makes complexity as a result of simple forces over time. So say we had our own simulation where we create a space. It could be an infinite space or a defined space, but then we put some sort of matter into it that has properties, and then we apply some initial forces. For our universe, those initial forces would be the Big Bang. So say we have this matter in our new simulation, and then we say this matter is all gonna fly away from each other at this speed, but it's also going to have this attraction to itself. Then we would see that everything would spread out and then just start contracting on itself, start changing properties, becoming new things. Obviously, it would be a very complex task, but in theory, it could be done. And in theory, over time, it would eventually, if it was programmed to create complexity, eventually it would get so complex that it would have some sort of life of its own. And if it was a successful simulation, then it would be able to reproduce a new simulation. And then there would be infinite simulations. And then that could be what the universe actually is. Super confusing, but this also leads us into kind of the discussion of God. So if there is someone or something who created this universe that we're in, and it truly is a simulation, then that person technically would be the God of our universe. And we realize that even if there is a God, I don't personally think that the God is all-knowing, because if we had a simulation that we just let run awry and become more and more complex over time, we wouldn't necessarily be able to have the computing power to know everything that's going on in the universe. Or maybe we would, but even if we could, we probably wouldn't care, and there would just be too much stuff. There would be an infinite amount of stuff going on. So it just led us to think about God too, and the concept of God. And it also led us down this path of determinism. Determinism is a pretty popular philosophy that a lot of people have, and it's basically saying that there is no randomness. Now let me explain. It's basically saying that everything that happens in the universe has a cause and an effect. So take the Big Bang, for example. If we start there, if we use that as a starting point, it's basically saying the Big Bang is like the breaking of a pool game. It's something is just starting and everything is spreading apart and things are bumping into each other, and there's no randomness. Everything you can link to a previous cause, and then everything has an effect. So hardcore determinists will say that even these things that I'm thinking right now, they're results of chemical interactions in my brain, and we can trace everything back to all the way to the Big Bang. And if we were to just rewind life in theory all the way back to the Big Bang and let it play out again, because it's like a physics problem, everything would happen in the same way. It's saying that there is no randomness. Everything is physically determined. Everything happens for a reason. And it's very confusing because it's very hard for people to wrap our minds around, because we have this experience of free will. We feel like we're thinking and we're making decisions, but a hardcore determinist will tell you, no, your brain is just reacting to your environment. People also say there must be randomness. I learned a lot about this when I was listening to Firas Zahabi, who's a very philosophical guy, and a guy in the MMA world. You should listen to his podcast with Joe Rogan. But he was explaining how there's no randomness. And he was saying that if you toss a dice, we think of that as random, right? It's like you don't know what it's going to land on. But he was saying we just deem anything that we can't calculate as random. So because we can't, our eyes don't move fast enough, our brains don't move fast enough to process what side of the dice the land's going to be on. If you took a slow motion camera and you took a bunch of physicists in a room and you had them analyze it slowly, then they would be able to predict which side of the dice it was going to land on. So it's saying that we just call things random that we don't have an understanding of or a capacity to calculate what's going to happen. So the universe is obviously so complex that we can't really calculate what's going to happen. So we attribute a lot of things in the universe to randomness, when in reality, or I don't know if it's in reality, but a determinist would think that everything happens for a reason. Everything had a cause. And I kind of agree with this to a large extent. Like you could, if you were smart enough, or if you had enough computational power, you could track anything that happens back to something that made it happen. It reminds me of the butterfly effect too, when we think of like a tornado being caused in Kansas, being caused by the flap of a butterfly's wing in Thailand. It's like these small things can have drastic effects that then ripple out into the rest of the world and cause like the perfect alignment for something to happen. Like that's another thing we deem random, right? Is the weather. We think that the weather is random. Oh, that cloud in the sky, it's random. Oh, we can't predict it, so it's random. But in reality, it's all happening for a reason. And just because we can't predict it doesn't mean that it's fully random. But what if there's things that nobody could predict? And a lot of these things, yeah, nobody really could predict. Like, you would have to have a level of technology that's almost unimaginable for you to be able to predict these things. And the weather, like, that's already basically out of our capacity to calculate, right? It's pretty complex. There's a lot going on in the weather. But then you break it down, you go deeper into the universe, and you think, oh, like, what about the movement, the seemingly random movement of these particles? And we can't calculate it, we can't understand it. And scientists will call some phenomena like this, like the missing variable, or proof that randomness exists. And it in another way, like, it kind of is proof that randomness exists, because who is going to be able to calculate this? Like, I mean, you could argue some alien society with better computational power can calculate this, but in reality, the only person who could theoretically calculate this is a conceptual God, right? So it's, yeah, it kind of, randomness kind of relies on God as a theoretical, all-knowing being. The only person who can know some of these random things in the universe is someone who knows everything and has infinite computational power. And that just doesn't exist, at least we don't know it. But if everything was a simulation, then the God, probably, like, the creator of the simulation, would he know everything, or would he not know everything? If he knows everything, then that means that everything is predictable and everything happens for a reason and is therefore determined, like it says in Determinism. If he doesn't know anything, then if he doesn't know everything, then that, I guess, is randomness. But it gets pretty crazy. So we kind of broke the idea of God into these two different categories. There could either be a deterministic God, who is someone who has infinite computing power and is all-knowing, and it would basically be someone who can, like, scroll through this simulation and see everything that's happened and zoom in and have just infinite power to know anything that's happening at any speck of the universe. Then you have a randomness God, who you could say, if you're arguing that there is randomness, you could think of the Big Bang as something that's random. You could just say, maybe if there was a God, he just said, boom, flick of my fingers, everything at this point is going to explode, and it's not calculated. It's more just a random exertion of energy in different directions. So yeah, and then it's like, would this God be the creator of the parameters in the simulation, or would he just be like this gigantic matter random generator who just causes chaos in the world and then it just flows? And this led us down this very interesting conversation, because I've been very interested in the idea that life is a balance of chaos and order. I mean, you see these motifs in all types of religions. You see it in Taoism and Buddhism, with the yin and yang, one side representing chaos, one side representing order. And then Jordan Peterson often describes meaning, the idea of meaning, as a balance of chaos and order. And I mean, if you look anywhere in life, you can kind of understand that this is true. It seems like if you look at a tree, right? A tree is going to do what a tree does, right? It's going to go towards the sun, and therefore it has this kind of order to it. Like, a tree is going to grow towards the sun. It needs these things to live. Like, there's a certain, like, order and definitiveness that's, like, set in stone. At the same time, there's some randomness in that the tree seems to move randomly out, reaching for the sun. And in all of these examples, it's the same way. Like, you see it all across nature. It's this balance of chaos and order. this balance of expansion and contraction. And I definitely believe in this. I believe that that's the recipe for complexity, is this expansion but simultaneously contraction. And I think that you could argue that the expansion is a representation of chaos and just moving outwards kind of randomly. Just like the fungi in the metro example. The fungi is moving out kind of chaotically at first. And then where the order comes in is once it reaches these points of nutrients, it has an order. It has a rule set to say, oh, if there's nutrients there, I'm going to reinforce that pathway. And so then it starts defining those pathways. And so, yeah, if there was only chaos, a tree would just be infinite branching out with no direction. But because there's some order to it, it has this direction towards the sun, right? So everything has this balance of chaos and order. And we realize the same must be true just in the universe broadly, based on this whole conversation we had about determinism and randomness. When we were talking about this, it all of a sudden clicked that determinism is a representation of order in the universe. And it's a representation of the fact that things do follow a cause and effect. Like, things do happen for a reason, and they cause other things to happen. And there's kind of a logical flow of this happened because of this, happened because of this. Just like I was mentioning in billiards balls. Like, you could see a huge game of billiards or pool after the break. You could see it as being random, but in reality, if you calculated all the forces, you would be able to rewind it, and the same thing would happen. If you did the exact same break, the exact same movement of the balls would happen, and the balls would end up in the exact same place. So this is kind of how determinism works, and it's a very orderly thing. But then, almost inherently, we need this idea of randomness, this idea of chaos, of what started the Big Bang. Like, are the parameters of the universe random? Like, is 9.8 meters per second like a calculated, precise thing that God chose for the speed of gravity or the acceleration of gravity? Or is it just a random parameter, right? Is there some randomness? And this randomness is the chaos that balances it out. And so it was just this crazy conversation that we were talking about the most modern science that we have, and we were going into what's gravity, what are the smallest particles. We were talking about quarks and neutrinos and photons, and talking about do electrons actually have mass, and David Bohm and the missing variable and the double slit experiment, and all these complex pieces of science where we're looking super deep into what actually is matter, what is the universe. And you can take it in a super scientific way, and then you come to the same conclusions as people thousands of years ago who had this intuitive understanding that life is just a balance between chaos and order. And it was so interesting how many different pathways we went through, how many doors we explored, how many rabbit holes we went down to still end up at the same conclusion that life is a balance of chaos and order, and still not knowing anything else. We don't know how big the universe is. We don't know if there's God. We don't know if there's aliens. But all we know is that life seems to follow these patterns, and it's like, how do we take this? So I think some of the takeaways that I took away that I'll probably try to apply in my life, and that I encourage other people to apply in their life, is to embrace the unknown, chaos, right? To accept the known, like, think about what we already know, think about what we know is true, what is the order of the universe, and then try to balance these two things, right? And then also stop overthinking, because you can it's one of these things that it's like we're never going to know the meaning of life. We're never going to know the way the universe works exactly. So why should we spend all of our time thinking about it? I think it's good to understand what we do know, but we also need to just accept that there's going to be some things we will probably never figure out, and I don't know if anyone will ever figure it out. I think it would take God to be able to figure it out, and I'm not sure if that exists. Like, we just don't know. So you can't overthink it. You just got to recognize the patterns and try to flow with the patterns within the rules that life gives us. So that was kind of a summary of it. Be what you know you are, avoid overthinking, seek balance, and embrace the unknown. So I hope you enjoy.